everybody. My name is Greg Brzezinski, and I am the director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies. And thank you all for coming to our event, which I've been very much looking forward to on semiconductor supply chains in the Indo-Pacific. I just want to briefly introduce our center before I turn over things to today's moderator, Deepa Alapalli. The Sigur Center's basic purpose is to try to improve the quality of research and education about Asia in the Washington area and more broadly in the nation at large. We also aim to promote dialogue between scholars and policymakers in the East Asian studies field. I should also note that we have an extensive amount of Taiwan programming. We're also going to have a Taiwan conference in May. Please join the Sigur Center's mailing lists. In addition to our Taiwan programming, we also have a variety of other programs that we'll be hosting over the rest of the academic year. Finally, I would just like to say I'm also the director of the Asian Studies MA program. So for those of you in the audience who are thinking about doing an Asian Studies MA or an MA degree, please look carefully at the Elliott School. We're the only school in the DC area that does this many Taiwan-related events. We're the only school in the DC area that has an Asian Studies Center like the Sigur Center. And we're the only school in the DC area that has its own Institute for Korean Studies. So please keep us in mind if you're thinking about graduate school and international affairs, or if you know somebody else who is. With that having been said, I am very pleased to turn over today's event to the moderator, Deepa Alapalli, who is a research professor at the George Washington University and is also the associate director for the associate director of the Sigur Center, the author of numerous books and articles related to the Indo-Pacific. Deepa.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks, Greg. Such a great thing to see so many of you out here today on this really nice spring morning. As Greg says, it's part of our Taiwan Roundtable series, and this topic, I was just in India, and when I was at the airport catching a taxi, the taxi driver told me, apologize for the entertainment system being down for about a month. And I said, so what's the problem? He said, Madam, supply chain problems. I said, okay. I realize now that actually it was a semiconductor supply chain problem specifically that was the issue. And, from that level to the global forces that we're seeing with the supply chain disruptions, very big forces that affect all our lives on an ongoing basis. And so, as it turns out, Asia dominates the supply chains in semiconductors. And we have today the focus on Asia, on the Indo-Pacific. And we are going to be hearing a lot about the resiliency of supply chain, the supply chain performance and so forth, and also how these three dominant players, especially two dominant, and I would say, in fact, one that's actually almost like a superpower in semiconductors, that's Taiwan. How are things playing out in their both economic and geopolitical strategies? Where are they moving toward, and what can we expect in the future? And we have, as I said, three speakers who are going to take us through the key players, starting with Taiwan and then South Korea and Japan. So I'll start by, what I'll do is I'll just introduce all three speakers and then turn it over to them. I've asked them to speak for about 12 minutes or so, following which I will have a very brief conversation with them. And then I will turn it over to the Q&A with the audiences. So first off, on Taiwan, we have Laura Danielson. She's the Vice President of the U.S.-Taiwan Business Council since 2003. She's extremely knowledgeable on industry matters and current Taiwan policy issues, and has a lot of firsthand experience with US and businesses, especially in semiconductor industry. Their group just finished last year a big report on semiconductors, and she just told me they're doing another one that's coming out in June. She's going to talk about Taiwan's central role and the spinoffs from that role. They're handling it. We then turn to Korea, the next important player, with Daniel followed by Jeffrey Bean on Japan. I have to say it's a special pleasure for me to introduce the two of them. They're both GW products. So I'm from GW. You get to be on panels like this. So students who want to come here and study, you can just use these as two good examples. Well, Daniel is an associate at the Institute for Korean American Studies and a former Harold W. Rosenthal Fellow in the U.S. House. He's also a fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research in the past. He's published extensively. He's currently a PhD candidate at Georgia Tech. Before that, he did law school here. He's a JD from GW's law school. And finally, last but not least, Jeffrey Bean comes to us from Observer Research Foundation, where he is the program manager for technology policy. And prior to joining ORF, Jeffrey was a visiting fellow at East-West Center and Tama University, where he conducted a lot of research on US-Japan relations and emerging technology supply chain disruptions with a focus on semiconductors. So, and he has an MA in security policy studies from GW. So when the chips are down, these are the three people that we can turn to for their expertise. I couldn't resist that. All right, with that, let me turn it over to Lotta, and I've told them they can either sit there or come up here, their choice.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna sit here. I think that's more comfortable for me. So thank you so much, Deepa. I really appreciate the introduction, and thank you to the Sigur Center for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this very important topic that is very increasingly more important to our lives. Like Deepa said, they're semiconductors or chips. I'm going to use the two interchangeably. Are really key to our lives. They're in our appliances. They're in cars. They're in toys. They're in textiles. They are in everything that we see, including things like missiles and defense equipment and space equipment. And so it's really important. Taiwan plays an incredibly crucial role in this semiconductor industry. I would bet that every single one of you have a Taiwan-produced chip in your pocket. How did Taiwan get so important? Well, Taiwan has spent the last 40 years basically trying to become an important factor, an important nexus for the semiconductor industry. They are the originator of what's known as the foundry model, which separates out design from production, and they've been really focused on doing production in Taiwan. They have had a lot of government investment in the industry in Taiwan, as well as companies really focused on capital expenditures and expenditures into R&D as well, in order to build their own really important nexus here on Taiwan. We are seeing foreign investment as well in Taiwan and the semiconductor industry from US companies such as Micron, for example. And what we basically ended up with was a clustering effect, focused and centered on the Hsinchu Science Park on the southwest part of Taiwan. It is a complete ecosystem when you come to semiconductor production in Taiwan. There are thousands of suppliers of semiconductor in this ecosystem, and it spans the spectrum of technologies, all the way from design to packaging and so on. And so basically today, Taiwan is a leading fab location. It's the nexus for high-level fabs. It's the center for 12-inch capacity fabs in the world. And 4 companies, TSMC, UMC, Vanguard, and PowerChip, together are the market share of them together is 67% or so of fabrication. So that's big. TSMC obviously is at the forefront of that as the leading star in Taiwan. In addition to that, they also are very focused on cutting edge technology. So at the lowest process nodes, at the very cutting edge technology, Taiwan is key. You're going to hear people talk about 92% market share. Well, that's a little bit excessive. 92% is for a specific type of logic chip. But in general, sort of 60 to 70% of the cutting edge is out of Taiwan. And that's still nothing to sneeze at, right? In addition, they have a substantial presence in sort of trailing edge, not quite so cutting edge technologies, and things like cars and appliances. In addition, Taiwan has a quite well-developed assembly and testing and packaging industry where companies like ASE are key. The United States is basically the leader for fabless, so the companies that don't have their own fabrication plants. You're talking about companies like Apple and Qualcomm and Broadcom and NVIDIA and so on. But Taiwan also has some fabless companies, including MediaTek, which is a key for telecommunications and 5G. So there's a concentration of capacity in Taiwan, and there's a concentration of know-how. And Taiwan is really well aware of the fact that this is an important industry for them. They really understand this. It is a star industry for Taiwan, something that everybody is very focused on maintaining. The chip prowess that they have supports their political goals as well, and they're well aware of that, especially the government. If you look at recent statements by President Tsai, for example, she talked about democracy chips, right? Working with the United States on semiconductor issues and something like that. And they're continuing to build on these, this prowess that they already have with additional new initiatives, as well as there's a new initiative surrounding Kaohsiung, for example, on that. And so they're continuing to build on this. But for Taiwan companies and for other companies in the region and around the world, there are lots of pressures that they're seeing on the semiconductor industry. There are talent shortages. I'm sure we'll come back to this. This is a very key part. There are issues surrounding things like intellectual property rights and trade secrets protections. So there's some of that. There's that sort of the design risk, right? There are supply risks as well. So where do you get your silicon wafers? How do you get access to your equipment that you need? How do you get access to the chemicals and the raw materials that you need? In particular, this is an important piece because China supplies a lot of the raw materials that are used in semiconductors. And then you have changes to consumer patterns. It's a demand issue as well. So you saw during the pandemic, for example, the switch away from automobiles to personal computing. And that change really, because you can't switch a fab to do things, new things all right away, that switch is also a switch in that is difficult to kind of deal with. For other places around the world, but particularly for Taiwan, there's also other risks such as typhoons, earthquakes, those types of things, and access to water and electricity is really key in the semiconductor industry, and so that's also something. But that's something that most people who are working in this industry are concerned about. For Taiwan, of course, there's the big one, the national security risk, right? Taiwan is very exposed to this because of the threat from China. That includes things like blockades and potential full-scale invasion of Taiwan, something that maybe not other countries in the region are facing. So Taiwan companies are trying to diversify to try to reduce some of these risks. But it's a key part is trying to balance this diversification with trying to keep semiconductors as their star industry. How do you balance that? And this is a concern in Taiwan, particularly about hollowing out the semiconductor industry. And I think we're probably going to see this discussion quite extensively through the lead up to the presidential election in 2024. It is a very real concern for Taiwan, not just government, but for in general in Taiwan. So why are Taiwan companies trying to diversify a little bit more and moving away from Taiwan? Well, if you move away from Taiwan, you gain proximity to your customers. A large majority of Taiwan companies have their customers in North America or Europe. So you move to those places, you get closer to your customers. There's political pressure from the US government and from other governments around the world as well to try to move away from Taiwan. And there's pressure from their customers as well. Some of the fabless companies would prefer to see a more distributed marketing, distributed manufacturing locations for their suppliers to reduce their own supply chain. So Taiwan companies are moving away from Taiwan to a certain extent, to places like the United States, Japan, and Germany as well. But this is a small fraction of the overall capacity that Taiwan companies have. And they're keeping their cutting edge technology at home. If you look at Arizona, where TSMC is spending 40 billion, they're currently moving into 5 nanometer and 4 nanometer there, potentially down to 3 nanometer for the next step of their investment. Meanwhile, in Taiwan, they are doing 2 nanometer, and there's plans there for the second half of 2025. And so, crucially as well, they are keeping research and development at home, and this is really the important part and parcel of the strategy that they have, is to keep R&D and their cutting edge processes at home. The US has a very sort of real view now of the supply chain risks. I think the pandemic kind of hit everybody hard, in particular the supply chain risk that we saw during the pandemic. And the pressures on Taiwan, they're starting to really pay attention to now. They're taking that into consideration. So the pandemic shortages of things like automotive chips and low-end chips really put a pin in something that the US had to try to how to solve. The Commerce Department has estimated that the damages to the US economy for the supply chain shortages during the pandemic is up to 240 billion. And the State Department actually did a hypothetical blockade of Taiwan, and they estimated that the damages to the US economy can be up to 2.5 trillion. And so this is obviously a concern. So that leads us to something else that we're probably going to talk more about, which is the Chips and Science Act, which is the US trying to really focus on bringing some of these production home. It's a very worthwhile thing for the US to do. They are already having some success. We're seeing some additional investments by companies like TSMC in Arizona, Intel is in Arizona and Ohio. You're seeing Samsung come into Texas, and other US companies like Micron are investing. So they're having some success of this. But the 50 billion that the US is allocating to this is probably not going to be enough, even to start. If you look at TSMC, their capex last year was 36 billion, and that's just TSMC. There is an estimate that says that approximately $400 billion is what the US would need to invest in order to just replicate the capacity that TSMC has right now. Obviously, that's not, it's not something that's going to happen quickly. You also need the technology needed. Technology is something that Taiwan has been spending 40 years to develop their technology, and this is not something that you can just do. And you also need this complete ecosystem, like I talked about earlier. That is what you also need. So it's not something that you can do quickly, but it's still a worthwhile endeavor. We're expecting to see sort of rejiggering around the edges of the supply chain, I think. I don't expect any real big short-time changes, but there will be some changes. Morris Zhang this week talked about the fact that the changes that we're seeing is probably going to increase the costs of semiconductors, which I think is valid. And the US is also attempting to kind of look at friendshoring for semiconductor chips. And they're working with Japan, with Korea, or places like India and Vietnam to look at friendshoring in order to sort of sustain their supply chain. Taiwan is not part of this discussion. That's unfortunate. It is very much a reliable friend that we should be looking at for friendshoring. And Taiwan has been supportive on things like export controls to China, for example. It would behoove us to take advantage of Taiwan's skills and expertise. And we really want to see Taiwan to be part of the solution. And they want to be part of the solution, despite the anxiety that they're feeling. One thing that we're seeing, the Chip 4 Alliance, I think is a good step forward for the US and for its partners. It's good for Taiwan, both politically and economically. And Japan and Korea are seen as partners. but they're also main competitors for Taiwan. And so how that's gonna play out, I think, will be very interesting. And I think that's very neat. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Laura, for kicking it off so well. And putting the Taiwan in context as to how it emerged. That's something that's often lost. And you ended on the note of the Chip4 Alliance. Well, and we have here the other two partners in that. And the question is, of course, competitive on the one hand, but also cooperative. How are they balancing that? Korea, is it seeing it as a new opportunity or something else?
Happy to touch into that a little bit, and I don't know if this is on.
Yeah, it is on.
Green is on, but can you not hear me?
Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe I'll borrow this. Thank you. So thank you, Deepa, Adam, Richard, for organizing this terrific event. I am an alma member of the alma mater, but I am a member of the law school, and so if my comments are insightful, you can associate me with GW, but if they're underwhelming, you can just take it on the law school. So I'm going to talk about Korea's role in the semiconductor supply chain, the challenges it faces as well as opportunities, and some of the regional implications, following a similar path that Lottie did. So first, it's probably clear to anybody in this room that South Korea plays a crucial role in the global chips supply chain. So sitting only behind the US, South Korea holds the second largest market share in the global semiconductor value chain. So as Lotta identified, Taiwan leads in some of the cutting edge manufacture, especially when it comes to the foundry segment. But South Korea overall, when you take from the soup to nuts and everything that's being done under Samsung and SK Hynix, they actually have the second largest market share. When it comes to the memory domain, South Korea dominates. They hold about 2/3 of global market share. It's far weaker in everything that's not memory. It only holds about 1%, but it's trying to develop and nurture this area, which I'll dive into a little bit more. So also, how did South Korea get here? So this, one other thing is, so as much as Korea is important to the global semiconductor supply chain, chips form the backbone of South Korea's own economy. South Korea is a trade-reliant country. Over 80% of South Korea's GDP comes from exports. Out of that portion, semiconductors account for about 20% of its total exports on average. Memory is about 2/3 of those exports. So the bottom line is, I knew I threw a lot of numbers at you. Thanks for obliging. But the bottom line is, South Korea is critical for the global supply chain in chips, and chips are crucial for South Korea's own industry and economy. So how did South Korea get here? Well, this interdependence is by design. South Korea's chip industry rose around a similar time as Taiwan's, about 40 years ago, basically in the early 1980s. And it was produced through a mix of heavy government subsidies and coordination, high-risk entrepreneurial maneuvering by South Korean businessmen, and some luck as well. So both the government and key South Korean conglomerates saw that semiconductors were going to be one of the greatest areas of economic development. They had virtually no stake in the game, though they had some early investments in the 1970s. And there's the well-known story that after much tossing and turning, the CEO of Samsung at the time declared in early 1983 that Samsung was now going to produce semiconductors. And they went out and they hired the best engineers, paying up to 3 times as much as the CEO's own salary. They got $400 million in government grants, spread across other industries as well. And the government twisted the arms of a lot of banks to give these companies low interest loans. So all this combined helped Samsung, within that same year, announce that it was producing the 64K DRAM memory chip, which is basically what Japan was making, and making at a fast level, making much of its revenue on. Within the next year, South Korea had developed the 256K DRAM chip, which is basically the cutting edge. And within a decade, South Korea had grabbed the largest global share of memory chips. In part, the reason why the Japan industry was flagged, and I'm sure Jeffrey will go into this a little bit, was luck. That in 1986, Japan was eating up a lot of the global market share in memory chips, And US firms were nervous, so they lobbied the US government to say, hey, let's put a block on this. And so in 1986, the US and Japan signed an agreement on semiconductors, basically setting a ceiling for the amount of Japanese chips that could enter the US market. That created an opening for South Korea to flood its chips into the US and elsewhere. So that said, South Korea isn't satisfied with just the memory market now. They're trying to obtain a greater market share when it comes to non-memory. And so without getting too technical, Samsung and SK Hynix, which you probably know, are what are known as integrated device manufacturers. In short, they provide end-to-end service, everything from design all the way to packaging. What that means is they build their own stuff in-house, but they also try to win contracts from other companies to build stuff for them. And so they're trying to capture a larger market share when it comes to these other companies. And the government's behind this. President Yoon has declared that he wants South Korea to capture 10% of the non-memory market share by 2030. Their current position, about 1%. So it's ambitious. Towards this end, last December, the South Korean parliament passed the K-CHIPS Act, Korea CHIPS Act, which increased tax cuts. The US, through the CHIPS Act, is at 25%. Taiwan is at 25%. China, could argue, is at 100%. South Korea passed its act and only allowing an increase from 6 to 8% in tax cuts. There was a lot of public pushback. And as of today, actually, the Strategy and Finance Committee in the National Assembly passed an increase where conglomerates would get a tax cut from 8 to 15%, and small and medium businesses would get up to 25%. So they're making some progress, but it still falls short of the competitive standards of the US, Taiwan, and elsewhere. In addition, President Yoon announced last week that the South Korean government wanted to create the world's largest chip cluster in and around Seoul and south of Seoul, attracting $261 billion in private investment. Most of this is absorbed, or most of this will be put in by Samsung. And the goal is that they can form a cluster of about 150 firms, again, covering end-to-end range in the supply chain, doing everything from design to manufacturing to assembly, testing, packaging, would be able to form this autarkic cluster around Seoul. In addition, given the need in high-skilled labor, they plan to train about 150,000 workers over 10 years. So that said, it won't be a breeze for many reasons. Some of the challenges are simply internal. So innovation and production requires high-skilled labor, and South Korea does have an advanced education system. However, they currently suffer the lowest birth rates in the world, lowest in the entire world. Second, the tax incentives are good, but still not great. And then, like in any industry, when you're trying to break through and create new plants, you've got to go through environmental issues, securing permits, and a lot of firms have had trouble expanding some of their the production in South Korea. At the same time, there are external constraints, and the big one is US-China rivalry. Now, many people here will know that thanks to South Korea's geographic position, it's long had to navigate between the two great powers. In the past, it was China and Japan. Today, it's China and the US. Now, China has, in recent years, become South Korea's most important trading partner. China accounts for about China is South Korea's top trading partner and accounts for about 60% of South Korea's semiconductor exports. Samsung and SK Hynix, both South Korean conglomerates, both have semiconductor manufacturing facilities in China, which is under increasing pressure right now, in part because of the US export controls. At the same time, China is now trying to do what South Korea and Japan did back in the 80s, which is trying to now eat into the memory market, right? Because compared to other chips, memory markets are a little bit more commoditized, meaning you can produce them at a mass level, and they're kind of interchangeable despite their overwhelming complexity. And so China is now trying to eat into that market. On the other hand, you have South Korea, which is a longtime ally. They share many interests across the security, economic, the values domain. The US is South Korea's second largest trading partner. But if we look at the balance of what the Yoon administration has done since taking office early last year, for now, it seems like the Yoon administration is leaning far more towards the US compared to what his predecessor did. For one, they released their Indo-Pacific strategy last November, which mirrors much of the language, the tone, and the vision of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. South Korea has agreed to join Chip 4 alliance that Alana mentioned. After some hesitation, they've also agreed to join the Quad, though it may be a more gradual process. And finally, ROC is in the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Chip 4, Quad, IPEF, all things that rankle China and that they see as ways to enclose democratic allies around them. The CHIPS Act is a double-edged sword. Yes, it provides grants and tax subsidies. At the same time, there's a number of restrictions, and there was some commerce guidance that was put out yesterday that clarifies some of those restrictions that did give South Korean companies a little bit of sigh of relief. In general, if you're a recipient of these U.S. funds, you can't expand your production in China. You can't have joint R&D projects in China. You can't license technology to China. Some of the clarification yesterday limited to, at least if it's on the if it's a legacy chip, it's on the lower end, then you can expand your facilities by 10%. If it's highly advanced, you can expand your facilities by 5%. So there's a little bit of legroom for Samsung and SK Hynix, as I mentioned, that have processes there. So at the end of the day, South Korea will have to leverage its position as the leading memory chip provider, but at the same time, be sure not to disrupt its strong economic relations with China and also maintain strong diplomatic ties with the US. Just a couple of thoughts on opportunities that are available, and then I'll close. So when it comes to working with Taiwan, at a national level, there's great complementarity. At the firm level, it's great competition, right? Because ideally, the idea of you see South Korea, Japan, Taiwan all dominate in certain areas, and it makes sense for them to all lean on their comparative strengths to build a more resilient supply chain among democratic partners. At the same time, when it comes to the firm level, these firms are competing for each other's contracts, right? TSMC and Samsung are going back and forth on winning Apple contracts, as well as with Intel. They're all trying to produce the most cutting edge chip. They're trying to win contracts, and so there's not a lot of natural love between them. At the same time, there was a recent initiative organized by at the company level, TSMC, Samsung, Intel, and so forth, where they agreed to create global standards for chip stacking. Basically, it used to be that in order to advance your chips, you just make them smaller and smaller and smaller and pack more into the chips. Now, because they're so small, where the transistors are smaller than the width of the strand of DNA, they're stacked them. And that's as simple as I can explain it. I actually don't understand the physics. But because it's so intricate and they align in different ways to other nodes, these global companies are recognizing that they need to cooperate and create some global standards so that these chips are interoperable with other systems. This seems to be a great roundup, if you will, a business-led approach where they're recognizing their own need, not for political purposes, but because of business needs in order to increase their own profits, where they're coming to some terms of alignment. So if that type of model can be replicated across other domains, that would be ideal. And with that, let me, last thing on Japan. So last week, you probably saw that the leaders of Japan and South Korea hailed a new chapter in their bilateral relations. They've long been plagued by the legacy of Japan's colonization under South Korea. However, after last week, a number of things have opened up for them. One is that they agreed to restore regular visits that have been put on hold over the past 12 years. Japan has agreed to ease restrictions on key semiconductor materials that were critical for South Korea because Japan leads in that domain. In return, South Korea agreed to drop a case at the WTO against Japan and put Japan back on the whitelist of trusted trading partners. And finally, in the security realm, South Korea has finally normalized and formalized their intelligence sharing agreement with the US and Japan, which is known as GSOMIA. And to continue to warm this relationship, Prime Minister Kishida has invited President Yoon to the G7 summit next month. So there's a lot of movement going on, a lot of progress, but still a lot of challenges remain. And so let me stop here.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, for bringing us today on South Korea, and it's in some sense is sort of a rising profile for that. We now turn to Japan, which has been mentioned several times, and how each have overtaken Japan. So I now will turn to Jeffrey, who's going to talk to us about Japan's chip challenge, getting back to the future. So what's Japan's strategy here?
Thank you, Deepa, and to the Sigur Center, the audience, and my fellow panelists for joining us today. I'm honored to be here. My responsibility and what I've been tasked with is discussing Japan's role in the semiconductor supply chain. So let me briefly outline where I'm headed. First, very briefly talk about yesteryear, today, and tomorrow with respect to Japan's role. Then I want to talk a little bit about the change in the national conversation in Japan with respect to its strategy connected to economic security. I want to talk a little bit about Japan's multilateral presence and leadership, both regionally and globally, and then turn to some Taiwan-specific comments given the structure of our event today. So, as Deepa mentioned, the subtitle of my talk is Getting Back to the Future, Japan's Chip Challenge. Why is that? Well, of course, Japan was on top of the world in chip production, as my colleagues have mentioned, in the 1980s, as a result of sustained efforts by Japanese industry in the early 1960s through the early 70s. By the late 70s and early 1980s, Japan emerged as the global leader in high quality, low cost, high volume chip production, specifically in memory and DRAM, in a way that, as Daniel outlined, caught US firms off guard, caught US government off guard, and essentially the US compelled Japan to negotiate an agreement which set both a price floor on the price of Japanese manufactured DRAM, thus enabling US competition to regain its position, as well as increasing the volume of foreign semiconductors which were allowed to be sold in the Japanese market. And through the efforts of Korea in particular, as well as some swings of fortune, the US created the Semitech Consortium, among other developments. The United States had regained its leadership in some ways, only to then be passed by Korea in that particular area, and then subsequently Taiwan. So if we fast forward 30 years and move to today, what does it look like? So after a period of essentially intense adjustment where Japanese firms struggled to adapt, I would say, to the fabless foundry model that my colleagues have already described, Japan underwent a process whereby firms are intentionally specialized within the supply chain now. And it remains a world leader and key player in the supply chain. So despite the statistics with respect to overall market share with respect to production, it's important to recognize the ubiquity of Japan within the supply chain. So where does it enjoy advantages? Well, for one thing, on design at the very outset, also with respect to production of semiconductor manufacturing equipment, Tokyo Electron and Nikon are still global leaders. With respect to semiconductor materials used in both the production processes as well as the actual raw materials, Japan is the world leader in high purity hydrogen fluoride, fluoride polyamide, and photoresist, which are used in lithography, etching, and deposition processes. So it's also the country in terms of firms present that produces the highest quality silicon wafers on which the silicon industry is based. In addition, with respect to production of components, Japan has key advantages in power semiconductors, in sensors, in VRM. If you were, for example, to drive out to Virginia or Maryland to Micro Center or head to Best Buy because you want to build your own x86 PC, which I encourage you to do, it's a lot of fun. It's something I've done quite a bit. And if you do that and you go and you look at the product description for a motherboard, the basis of a computer, it will advertise 100% Japanese capacitors, which I find fascinating. VRM, MOSFETs, anything to control voltage, Japanese firms enjoy a key position. In addition, as I think Lana and Daniel both mentioned, Japan still has a role on the production of legacy or mature node trailing edge chips that are utilized in all sorts of applications. Renesas Electronics and other firms still produce chips that are essential, as we saw during the supply chain semiconductor shortage in the pandemic, of things like automobiles, as well as manufacturing equipment for other things, everything from textiles to Tupperware. In addition, Japan remains a world leader in consumer electronics, so displays, cameras, and other technology that utilizes systems integration. And finally, we want to flag, of course, gaming consoles and other home entertainment devices. So as my colleagues mentioned, just like in Korea and in Taiwan and in the United States, Japan is not standing still. There are additional investments that are underway to ensure that at the very least Japan can retain its existing position while maybe growing on the markets. And I want to flag some of those initiatives. First, with respect to Taiwan, as I think a lot alluded to, the Japanese government is subsidizing an effort by TSMC and Sony to produce a new 5-nanometer production facility out in Kumamoto Prefecture. In addition, they opened already a research and development center in Ibaraki Prefecture in June of last year. That's a pretty key development. In addition, the Japanese government has facilitated the creation of a new consortium called Rapidus, which will or aims to produce a fabrication facility foundry at the 2-nanometer level up on Hokkaido in the next few years in partnership with IMEC and IBM, which is a pretty significant development there. In addition, just yesterday, Tokyo Electron, which I mentioned, it holds a key position in semiconductor manufacturing equipment, announced that they're building a new multi-billion-dollar facility in Oshu. I believe they're 7th in the area that focuses on wafer deposition lithography equipment. So a key there. Also, foreign investment is happening and still a key part of Japan's semiconductor role, in that companies like Micron Technologies have chosen to invest millions of dollars to upgrade their memory fabrication facility in Hiroshima. Kioxia and Western Digital have a joint venture, might turn into a merger, we'll see, on memory side, which it bears watching as well. So Japan is not standing still, and why is Japan taking these steps? What's the impetus behind this? We can talk more about the subsidies later. You heard from my colleagues sort of the government involvement in this, but at the conceptual level, the strategic conversation in Japan has changed in the last, say, 4 or 5 years, and that has taken an impetus on the political side to focus on economic security with respect to strategy. I want to sort of outline the origins of this and then talk about a couple of key components. In 2020, the Liberal Democratic Party got together, produced some intense research and thinking on Japan's position within emerging technologies and critical technologies, and its position within the global economy with respect to national security, and came up with some documents and some thinking that have informed subsequent government releases. So I'll just briefly touch on a few of those. First, in December of this past year, Japan released 3 national security related documents. One of them will highlight the national security strategy, its first in, I believe, 9 years. Within that document, for the first time, Japan recognizing the geopolitical challenge that China presents, called China a strategic competitor and a strategic challenge for Japan and the rest of the international community. And this is a pretty stark change if you compare to the 2013 national security strategy, where China is described as an issue of concern. So a big transition there into the recognition of the geopolitical environment. In addition, with respect to this focus on economic security, there's a push to better integrate on the civil military level Japan's defense industrial base, and a recognition of the importance of securing emerging technology. The second document I want to flag that we'll talk about a law that was passed by the Diet in May of last year, the Economic Security Promotion Act. This particular development put out by the Diet focuses on the need for firms within Japan to focus on national security considerations above, at times, market efficiency within their decision-making processes. And the law has 5 chapters and several different pillars. I'll highlight 2 that I think are particularly important. One is that the government put together a plan for small, medium, and large-sized firms to apply for subsidies on critical materials, including semiconductors, as well as different intellectual property development, and other materials such as things like rare earths and electric battery development, for example. The law requires, as I said, firms to think about economic security, but it also requires and emphasizes the importance of greater patent and IP protection within Japan's market, and ensuring that both there are regulations to protect sensitive tech and developments on a national security level, but also hints at, in addition to enforcement, it hints at potentially a greater role with respect to export controls. We can talk more about that later on. Finally, I want to again emphasize the importance of economic security in the sense that the Japanese have created a new cabinet minister level position whose sole focus is economic security and looks at both the running faster, the promotion end of the chain, as well as the protect end of the chain. Now I want to turn a little bit to, if Japan is having this conversation about economic security, it's well positioned with respect to engaging with foreign partners. And part of the work that I'm undertaking for ORF America is focused on tech alliances and how the United States and like-minded partners will coordinate efforts in emerging tech in a more complicated and competitive geopolitical environment. If you look at where Japan is, I think it's important to some extent, in contrast with Korea and Taiwan. Japan is a leader in regional economics and global multilateral institutions, fora, and arrangements in a way that maybe you wouldn't have expected if you looked at Japan's position about 15 years ago. On the market access side, which is supremely important to private sector, Japan is now driving the truck on CPTPP since the US withdrawal a few years ago. Japan is a member of the market access component of RCEP. And it's worth noting on CPTPP that Japan has looked favorably on Taiwan's application in 2021 and was decidedly cool toward China's application too. And of course, it requires unanimous consent. Again, we could talk more about that in the Q&A if you'd like. But in addition, on the market access side, RCEP, it's a participant in all the pillars of IPEF, which is the US's trade architecture framework that does not include a market access component explicitly. However, it does include a semiconductor supply chain and resiliency component. Japan is obviously a leading member within the G7, it's part of the G20. It signed what is effectively the EU's largest free trade agreement, the Economic Partnership Agreement. It's a leader in APAC. And then to Daniel's point earlier about the informal or more ad hoc arrangements, Japan is in the Quad, which has a semiconductor resiliency component. It's part of Chip 4. I'm waiting to see where that goes, but we can talk more about that. It's part of the T12. It's part of the Wassenaar arrangement on dual use tech. And it's also a member of what I've taken to calling the SME trio with respect to the Dutch, the Japanese, and the United States on semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So, as I mentioned, they've taken steps to improve their relations with Korea. And just yesterday, Prime Minister Kishida announced an additional $75 billion as part of the free and open Indo-Pacific for greater investment in infrastructure and other projects throughout the Indo-Pacific. I want to make about 1 minute of comments on Taiwan and point out that with respect to the US-Japan relationship, it's important to bear in mind the context of Taiwan-Japan relations. And so, in addition to welcoming Taiwan's application for TPP, Japan and Taiwan enjoy a deeply interconnected consumer electronics and semiconductor supply chain, including on components and design. In 2021, Japanese and Taiwanese lawmakers reached an agreement to specifically focus on semiconductor supply chain security. And with respect to total trade, it's important to remember that Japan-Taiwan trade totaled $90 billion in 2021. And Taiwan's third largest trading partner is Japan. And finally, Japan's foreign direct investment over, I believe, the last 50 years is something along the lines of 48.7 billion in Taiwan specifically. So important to flag. I want to commend President Tsai Ing-wen, who's in office now, for her attention to detail in maintaining this relationship and recognizing the importance that Japan plays despite the relative revolving door in recent years prior to the Kishida administration in leadership. And the attention paid there, I think, is pretty important in recognition of Japan's role just generally, not just with respect to the semiconductor supply chain. Finally, I'll close with this comment. The late former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe mentioned several times that an emergency over Taiwan is an emergency for Japan, and thus an emergency for the US-Japan alliance. As we talk about securing the semiconductor supply chain in this era of geopolitical competition, while allowing firms to continue to prosper and innovate, there are hard conversations that have to happen that require political leadership with respect to costs. I'd like to talk more about that in the discussion. But to me, Japan has a head start over the rest of us in talking about the importance of economic security and being willing to absorb additional costs in a highly sensitive consumer electronics and semiconductor market. With that, I will pause my comments and look forward to the discussion and Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for that optimistic take on Japan moving forward. One of the things I see, there's a full house here today, and I'm not going to take too much time, but I will start off the Q&A by asking my own questions to the panelists. So we right now, one thing that's clear is that when you think about power relations, technology and critical technologies are an important part of that. And so while Taiwan has low power and because of constraints diplomatically and politically globally, it is a techno power. And we're seeing that in today's discussion. Others are taking it seriously and so forth. So my question, I'll start with Lana and ask, to what extent do you think Taiwan has been successful in leveraging its techno power superiority? And do you think that it's doing enough? Where could it do more? Or is it going to be constrained as it is in other areas?
Yeah, I think Taiwan is very much trying to use its power and technology in sort of expanding its international space and working on different initiatives with Japan, for example, and trying to do that. It just has so many constraints, and it's difficult to see that they've had some success. Again, they're part of the WTO. They have used their economic power to kind of have people focus on them a bit more maybe than they might otherwise do. But because of the political and diplomatic constraints faces, it's very difficult for them to grow, to use that power, technology power, to grow their diplomatic. China is just such a big behemoth.
Okay, staying on the Taiwan focus, let me just turn to Daniel and Jeffrey and say, one of the ways in which Taiwan's diplomatic leverage can increase is dependent on what Japan and South Korea do vis-a-vis Taiwan. So let me just ask you to go a little bit more into detail. If you see Korea and Japan changing their perspective, given the changes in the way in which supply chain semiconductor has become so much more important, has that had an impact in the way they now, you think, look at Taiwan? So maybe go down the line here, Daniel.
Yeah, it's a great question, and to the extent that Taiwan continues to maintain its dominance in some of the leading edge chips, I think South Korea, as well as the rest of the world, will continue to lean in on the reliance of Taiwanese foundries. At the same time, I think what we saw in that initiative, where companies are now cooperating at a broader level, increases also the interdependence between these two levels. It's from a historical standpoint, and hopefully not cutting too much on Lana's field, but in part why the Taiwanese Ministry of Economy back in the 70s encouraged Morris Chang to create TSMC was to create greater interdependence with the United States. In similar ways that also influenced some of the thinking in South Korea and Japan. But to the extent that Taiwan continues to demonstrate how vital it is to the supply chain, the global supply chain, the more that South Korea and other countries, I think, will also continue to work to ensure that that resilience stays strong.
Jeffrey, to add?
I guess for the work that I've been engaged in recently, as others have alluded to, export controls is a huge topic right now as it relates to the semiconductor industry more broadly, as well as the geopolitical competition underway between the United States and China, or the United States and like-minded partners and China. I think with respect to this aspect of how Japanese view Taiwan, outside of the fact that it's incredibly important economically, as I mentioned, the ties between the two countries, or two economies, worth noting that from a government perspective, the engagement on export controls will require leadership within those countries as well, right? So when you see, for example, on the chip control, chip manufacturing SME control agreement, you see resistance in Japan from Tokyo Electron and Nikon to this agreement, which we don't have a lot of detail about, between the Dutch and the United States controlling both EUV technology that the Dutch firm ASML produces, as well as what Nikon and Tokyo Electron and Canon are introducing on the deep ultraviolet side. You see that pushback. I think to the extent that Taiwan is engaged in these multilateral arrangements, some of that legitimization may occur by default. Now, the chip 4, it seems from my perspective, Taiwan has been reasonably enthusiastic. The Japanese have been reasonably enthusiastic. Koreans have not been thus far super enthusiastic. Where does that go? Does it focus strictly on promotion or strictly on protection? Does it focus strictly on promotion? How much of that is cooperation on innovation and research and development at the governmental level internationally between those 4 partners? And if that happens, then there's a much better chance than if it's strictly export control oriented in terms of the protection aspect. I think that level of cooperation already exists among the private sector firms, and at the governmental level, can that additional cooperation continue?
Okay, thank you, all of you. I will reserve the right to the last question, but in the meantime, I'm going to open it up to the audience. And I think, Adam, do we have
We have
both two sides? Because the crowd is big over here. Okay, let's start right here with Garrett in the front. And please introduce yourself and your affiliation.
My name is Garrett van der Wees. I'm teaching a course on current issues with East Asia here at George Washington Ellis School. I'm from the Netherlands, as you might know from my name. And back home, we have a very big discussion on the export controls on ASML, of course, with people trying to decide what type of machine should be on the export list or not. And one argument says, well, we only need to restrict the top level, the high end, and not really the lower end. But the counter argument is that the defense system in China uses all kind of chips from the top level to the basic home refrigerated chips that you put in your refrigerator. So where would you come down on this particular issue? Would it be better to restrict basically the whole range, or can we have a solution by only restricting the top end?
You want to take that? Or? You mentioned.
I did. I opened the door there.
You did.
You did. It is the focus of a lot of work on engagements with, so it's also a huge conversation right now. I think your question gets to the heart of one of the key challenges, which is if you're going to, as I alluded to, if you're going to segment the supply chain, whether it's in semiconductor manufacturing equipment or across the entire set of the industry and sub-industries for emerging technology, you have a real hard choice to make, because up until now, the Chinese have tried considerably within mainland China. The PRC and the CCP have made sustained efforts to try to improve China's position within the semiconductor supply chain. While they have achieved some modest gains, they're still way behind and still reliant heavily on foreign produced imports for semiconductors, just overwhelmingly so. And so now, if you take steps that limit either their access to those chips or their ability to develop them, then you're potentially incentivizing the production of said chips. Now, the October 7th and October 2022 export controls that were implemented with respect to semiconductors tried to take the approach of, well, we're going to target one very specific narrow area of chips, specifically advanced compute accelerators like high-end GPUs that are used for modeling and AI-based technology, while also limiting China's ability to procure equipment that can be used to manufacture chips at the 18 nanometer half-pitch DRAM or better 128 layer NAND or better, and 16 to 14 nanometer FinFET or better. And so the approach, and then of course the US license requirement within that. So the approach there seems to be, well, we want to allow our firms in the US and elsewhere to continue to sell their chips to the Chinese at a certain level to retain some reliance, while also preventing China from leaping forward in these areas that are deemed to be sensitive to national security or military development. In the case of the Netherlands specifically, I think it's fascinating because the Dutch will, as you know very well, will essentially have to change their export control laws or adopt or choose to adopt different measures to enforce the agreement. And there's some discussion, as I understand it, in the Netherlands right now about how that will happen. You may know more than I do, but there also is discussion about, well, does this need to be taken to the European Union if the Netherlands chooses to reach this agreement? So for Taiwan and for the United States, as well as Japan and Korea, this is a pretty critical issue to get right. And thus far, because the US controls are effectively unilateral in some of these areas, the sustainability in the long term, I think, is in question. So reaching agreement through something like Chip 4 would enhance both the legitimacy and the effectiveness of these controls in the long term. It has to be multilateral to work. The SME trio agreement is probably the best first step there, but we don't have a lot of details, and we may not have a lot of details. There's a great report put out by colleagues in my former institution, CSIS, by Greg Allen and Emily Benson, that breaks this down and basically speculates about what is in the agreement with highly informed analysis, in my view. I'll defer to others if others have folks in.
Looks like you've covered a lot, so I think move on. Okay, let's see. There were questions. Okay, they're all in this area. Okay, why don't we just go? Yes, you, and then. Come back. Yes.
Hi, my name is Emily Zimmerman. I'm a student at the Elliott School. And one major concern that the US has about these supply chains is their vulnerability to tampering from China. We can see this through the big hack issue that happened a couple of years ago. And these policies are perhaps not comprehensive enough to secure these technologies on both the US and China side. What role can Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan play to contribute to the policy making to secure these hardware supply chain vulnerabilities?
Okay, Lara, I think Taiwan knows a bit about Chinese hacking.
Yes, I have some experience with that. It is definitely something that the US, the US, Taiwan, and Japan, and others are very concerned about. Taiwan has sits at the forefront of the Chinese hacking in particular. They, millions of hack attacks every day for all of their systems, and so they're very focused on developing resiliency in that hardware supply chain. Their factories and other places around the island are very much focused on blocking hack attacks or blocking any issues where where China is trying to gain access. The more important piece, I think, is not just physical hacks or whatever, trying to get information, but it's things like engineers from Taiwan bringing their know-how to China. It is trade secret protection in Taiwan, which they've been really focused on lately, to try to make sure that trade secret protection, there's lots of laws and lots of enforcement of those laws to protect the Taiwanese know-how. And so it's something that everybody who works in the hardware supply chain is very concerned about, and it's something that everybody's working on. And I think probably maybe the Chip Alliance would be a good opportunity for the partners to work together on what strategies are for blocking these types of Chinese sort of attempts at gaining access and gaining information.
Less specifically on the Korea side, but just broader multilaterally, because I think it's a great question. I mean, ultimately, these countries have to cooperate on combating intellectual property theft, cyber, all the gamut, and they have to do it at a multilateral level, right? Because as Jeffrey was talking, if you have unilateral export controls from the US, it basically just moves the market from the US to South Korea, Taiwan, and other places that are selling these chips. So they have to be multilateral, they have to be coordinated. Now, part of the difficulty in creating this type of multilateral regime is when you trade information about, when did you get hacked by whom, what content you're necessarily exposing, making vulnerable your trade secrets, right? Your profits, your market projections, and these, as we've seen, companies are very sensitive to give over. U.S. chip companies are reluctant to give it over to the own U.S. government, right? Because these are all it's all sensitive information, and so to the extent that they can work some of those kinks out, I think that could go a long way towards enforcement.
All right, yes, over here, and then I'll get back.
Okay, I mean, the title of this
Sorry,
is,
just your name and affiliation.
oh, I'm Satvik Pandyala, and I'm a research assistant at the Rising Powers Initiative here at GW. And the title of this talk is Semiconductor Supply Chains in the Indo-Pacific, but it really just feels like semiconductor supply chains in Northeast Asia. And what I would like to ask is, how are these countries really helping countries in the rest of Asia move up the value chain from just making electronics to actually getting into the semiconductor supply chain itself?
Okay. Which country is doing the most in that?
I mean, I think again, as I said, Taiwan sees the semiconductor industry as its star industry. They are willing to work with others. Their the new southbound policy is looking at other places in Southeast Asia to try to move into more of a partnership with them. But chips is not necessarily on the agenda for that. It is such an important piece of Taiwan's, and I think both Korea and Japan as well, that try to move that into other places in the Pacific. It's not necessarily a focus.
What about manufacturing chip?
Yes, so manufacturing is definitely something that they might consider moving other places. At the moment, they're moving to their customers, and so that's North America, that's Japan, that's Europe. And if that relationship changes, then Southeast Asia might be an interesting opportunity for them, but it's just not at that point.
Okay.
Maybe a great point on that. It's a great question. And in many ways, South Korea is trying to diversify its supply chains, manufacturing, in part because of the risk of continuing to do business in China. And now add on top the export controls against China. South Korean companies are even against more pressure to do it. Last year, when the Yoon administration released its Indo-Pacific strategy, what it signaled implicitly and explicitly is moving away from the long-standing paradigm of for security, go to the US, for economics, go to China. The administration has signaled that it's trying to move to security, US, economy, the world, right? To do that, it requires a great deal of other things, right? Not just manufacturing, right? Because to create a fab, not only do you need money, you need constant electric supplies, stable land, so forth and so forth. But the other aspect of this is, to the extent, this is tangential, but to the extent South Korea is also aiding broader infrastructure projects across the world that require both the use of chips and possibly even eventually the creation of maybe on the lower end chips. That would also be a way to instigate more diverse supply chains.
Very quickly, since we're Japan, Korea, Taiwan today, but based here in the United States, I think it's important to flag Secretary of Commerce Raimondo was in India last week, if memory serves, and this is a specific issue for the government of India and investment attempting to move up the value chain with respect to semiconductors, and there's some very specific areas where U.S. and international companies are entering into agreements with Indian actors to attempt to move up the value chain there. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but I would encourage you to look at that as a potential area. So maybe the U.S. has a more proactive role, certainly with respect to U.S. industry.
Okay, yes, the Northeast Asia focuses, these three are the key in semiconductors. But all right, let's go to the way back there. Yes.
Hi, I'm a GDAF student. I'm first year and I'm from Taiwan. And my father runs a semiconductor company in Taiwan, in Kaohsiung. So I have questions about Taiwan. So as you mentioned about like a CHIP Act is not enough, like one CHIP Act is not enough. So how about another strategy? It's like more US investment in Taiwan and play as like economic deterrence to China? Is it better to like more chip acts better than more investment in Taiwan? Is it more effective? That's my questions.
Okay, great question.
Yeah, that's a
Maybe everybody wants to.
Good question.
jump in.
I do think that US companies in particular are still interested in investing in Taiwan, in the semiconductor industry, but also in technology in general. We're seeing investments still from companies like Google and IBM and others in Taiwan in the technology. They're building data centers and things like that. They're also investing in the semiconductor industry in Taiwan. It is a dual approach, I think, much more so than one or the other. The CHIP Act is a great start, but it's going to take a little bit more focus to kind of build out what's going to happen with that over the next decade, which is really you're looking at semiconductor investment. It's not it's not a year. It's like 3 or 4 years before you can get anything out of the investment that you do. But companies in the U.S. are still looking at Taiwan as an investment destination. They are not, focused exclusively on the CHIP Act investments here in the U.S.
Okay, anyway, all right, let me take a question from this side of the room, yes.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. So Taiwan is calcium carbonate limestone or metamorphosed limestone, which means it needs inputs from outside of Taiwan, bolides of highly purified silica and secondarily germanium. Who are the go-to guys for those bolides of silica? And is there a tendency to just in time import those things, or are there warehouses that have 5 years worth of silica bolides in Taiwan?
It's a very specific technical question that I'm not sure that I'm really the right person to answer. But I do think that the just-in-time tends to be the traditional way of doing it. You can't. There's not enough storage space on Taiwan to keep all those supplies there. And they do have, like I mentioned earlier, is one of the reasons that Taiwan is looking at resiliency in the supply chain is because raw materials are being imported from other places. It is a supply issue of chemicals and raw materials from other places around the world. In particular, the Chinese raw materials is a very important sort of input into the Taiwan semiconductor industry. As for the specifics that you ask, I'm sorry, I don't know that.
Thank you. Gentleman over here.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Neil Simmons. I'm a non-resident fellow at Center for Global Development. I work in a lot with U.S.-Africa relations. One of the things I wanted to know is nobody's really, I know this is about South Asia or Southeast Asia or East Asia, but for semiconductors, we know the core, it's the silica, it's used for semiconductors. Where does Africa, how do these countries partner with a region like Africa? Because even though Africa doesn't compete or doesn't make semiconductors, we still do a lot of our critical minerals are being used in electric vehicles, EVs, and others come from Africa. Congo, Zimbabwe, a few months ago said they no longer allow export of raw materials outside of the country. They make exception to China. That was interesting. But where does a continent or a region like Africa and other emerging markets play in this conversation?
Okay, yeah, we know China has a head start in Africa on this, but what about the others? Are they thinking about this? Anybody?
I don't know that I'm not again sort of qualified to answer that question. It's not Africa is not something that I cover particularly, but it is certainly something that Taiwan is looking at is where to expand the resources that they need. How looking at importing from other places around the world. I don't know of any particular initiatives on Africa, but it would make sense to me that the Taiwan companies would be looking at all the options that they have for raw materials and for other sort of inputs into their supply chain.
Maybe just a brief note to bridge the previous two questions. That China dominates the field when it comes to raw materials. I don't know about the specific components, but in part the reason they do is that they're willing to suffer the environmental costs that it takes in order to extract these materials. So other countries have it. The U.S. has key ingredients as well, but they're not willing to go through the environmental damage. I don't know about the case of Africa. They may not, but that'd be definitely an interesting area to explore.
All right, an underexplored area over here. Okay, yep. In the middle over here. Just raise your hand. Okay, hang on, there's a mic behind you.
My name is Mitchum. I'm a first year master's student in the Asian Studies program. I just wanted to ask, like, what is the nature of Korean-Taiwan relations politically? And while there is competition in the semiconductor industry, as we've seen, is there also cooperation in finance and trade relations to a large degree?
Okay, I think that's yours and yours.
The Korea-Taiwan relationship is a bit fraught, say, but that is something that the current government in Taiwan is trying to change. I am not, again, I'm a Taiwan person. I don't really do that much about Korea, but Taiwan is always focused on working with other countries in the region. Whether they're able to do so or not often depends on the other party and their sort of relationship with China. As we heard earlier, Daniel said China-Korea relationship is quite close, and so I don't know if you have anything particular on that.
And not particular, but maybe general, that they actually are at least for South Korea, Taiwan is one of the top 10 trading partners. And guess what they trade with each other? Semiconductors. So there's that. They of course share democratic values, robust rule of law, and at least on the security angle, they also carefully monitor what's happening on their each other's territory, if you will, cross-strait relations and North-South Korea relations. In a long lost footnote in history, at least one of the reasons Mao did invade Taiwan in the early 50s is because he wanted to protect his border against North Korea when the Korean War was going on. And so that at least in part stayed his hand. So it seems that even if it's maybe to a second or third degree, what happens on either border affects what happens broadly in the region.
Okay, thank you. Yes, right behind Mitchum.
Hello, my name is Anna Lurch. I'm an undergraduate sophomore in the Elliott School, and I'm involved in an Oregon campus called SES, and we're running a crisis simulation war game on Taiwan and different issues in that area. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on other areas of conflict between China and Taiwan beyond hacking, maybe with raw materials importing or other issues. Especially on like how serious these issues are related to hard security threats from China to Taiwan, and whether like that relationship, whether these are more separate issues or whether they could have a strong relationship.
So
this is beyond what the panel was asked to do, but I'll leave it to their discretion.
China is the main threat for Taiwan, not just on the economic front, but on the national security front as well. There are a variety of different scenarios, so anything from China cutting undersea cables in Taiwan Strait in order to block the communication from the island to the rest of the world. That's something that we've seen maybe potentially happening right now. There are potential blockades, which they practiced last year. And so it's a range of issues that we can potentially see in the Taiwan Strait. I think the discussion that was had earlier this week, based on Robert Ryan's comments, the underlying assumptions there are that the U.S. cannot allow Taiwan to go to China because of these sort of issues that we talked about on the importance of semiconductors. And I think that there's a lot of different opportunities for China to block Taiwan's economic and national security self-determination, I think. a war game is definitely, we've seen quite a few of those, see what happened with the conflict in Taiwan Strait. I think it's definitely a concern. Again, my work is primarily on behalf of US companies in Taiwan, and they are concerned, obviously, about these issues, but the concern is not really having any effect at this point. Really what we're seeing is people making contingency planning, which they should be doing anyway. But they are still investing in Taiwan, still focused on Taiwan trade and so on. And it is an important piece of the puzzle, but it tends to overshadow everything else when you talk about Taiwan. And so it's nice to be actually talking about semiconductors, which is an important piece, and partnership and cooperation, rather than the potential of a war in the Strait.
All right, thanks for stretching yourself over there, Laura. All right, let's see, we have some questions on this side. The lady over there.
Hello, this is Kaylee Park in Elliott School, and I have a question about Korean and Taiwanese concern about U.S. government and U.S. companies, because like in security and economy for all of the fields, the U.S. is emphasizing about alliance, and they're making chiefs alliance chips for alliance and other attempts to make multilateral cooperation. But at the same time, Korean and Taiwanese companies are concerned about U.S. goal in this industry because now U.S. is investing to fab manufacturing, which was Taiwanese and Koreans build, and Intel is growing really fast. So some of these companies are concerning about the CHIPS Act and other trade policies and thinking that this is our turn to get shocked by US again, like Japan did. So I want to know how would US will deal with this kind of concerns. Thank you.
All right. From the other side, a question. Go ahead.
How the US will deal with these concerns is that the United States does so the CHIPS Act and other efforts on developing a US side semiconductor sector is really on behalf of the United States. The United States is doing what they feel that they need to do. And on the other hand, you have Taiwan and Korea, but I don't speak for Taiwan either, but
I don't figure Korea.
yeah, exactly. But they're trying to do what's best for their companies and for their politics as well. So yes, there are going to be some friction there. And I think that the United States is attempting to kind of build back their manufacturing because they see some of the issues that could come from a potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait, from issues that we're seeing in the supply chain, and they're trying to work on resiliency. The U.S. is happy to work with other partners on trying to build this industry. And Taiwan companies are willing to work with the United States to do so. And I think it's much more of a partnership. Of course, US is a much larger partner, and so they can really sort of dictate a lot of things. But as we saw, some of the restrictions on the CHIPS Act money for companies is important. But it is something that the U.S. and Taiwan can work together on, and that's what they're doing.
Maybe just 2 quick points. One, it seems that the CHIPS Act export controls, in many ways, nobody says it explicitly, but the United States is expanding the semiconductor industry. I don't know if they're necessarily taking away from opportunities that would already happen, right? It's an interesting counterfactual. If the U.S. didn't have the CHIPS Act, would these companies have invested all this in their own home state? Maybe, I mean, in part, COVID added great incentives to up the manufacturing, but overall, because it's only $52 billion, again, is a lot for me. It's a small drop in the bucket when it comes to creating fabs. At the same time, I think what, for instance, South Korea is doing is probably a smart approach, which is to try to take advantage of some of the CHIPS money, but also double down on self-strengthening at home. Right? They'll get a small portion of $52 billion from the CHIPS Act. They've declared that they're going to invest $251 billion in South Korea. right? So I think the smart approach is to, yes, expand, but also double down on your own home turf so that you've got greater leverage in the global supply chain when it comes to creating global standards.
Okay, good advice. Let's see if there's any other question. We're running out of time. Maybe I'll take two questions over here and over there. Yeah, over here, please, and then the gentleman over there in the back.
Oh, thank you. My name is Ken Scadley from Marubeni Corporation. So I want to throw one very hypothetical but simple question, if I may. So because a lot of said the semiconductor landscape is not only 4 or 5 years, maybe 10 or decades. So it seems the Taiwan, both Taiwan and the US will hold a presidential election next year. So do you think what kind of which part of the environmental surrounding environment or the policy surrounding the semiconductor industry will remain or change if the ruling party, both of the ruling party in the US and Taiwan is defeated?
Okay, that was not a simple question. That was a bit, but okay. Very quick question.
I don't know that,
Sorry, Mark, I was
Sorry,
one more.
Yeah, sorry.
Call it a day. Quick question, please.
Sorry. Good afternoon. My name is Hanlin Ryu. I'm an undergraduate freshman at the Elliott School of International Affairs. My question is regarding the Chips and Sciences Act and its effect to the companies mainly in Taiwan and South Korea. So when I was reading about these acts, I felt like I couldn't lose the feeling that it was specifically targeted at the leading companies, especially the TSMC, Samsung, SK Hynix, in order to somewhat gain US competitiveness in the semiconductor field. So what do you think is the end goal of the United States when it comes to these intentions behind the act? Is it to somewhat replicate the effects of the 1980s against Japan, or is it to bolster the relations with the allies in the semiconductor field?
Okay, similar question asked a different way, but let's take these two, if you will. Daniel, you want to start with the.
Well, I would say you read it exactly as it was intended, which is in part to bring manufacturing, expand some manufacturing here, also to increase the US's own supply chain resiliency. In part, a lot of this was spurred by what happened in COVID, a lot of some random natural disasters that happened all around the same time in Taiwan, Japan, and Texas, which intervened in the supply chain making process. And the US, both the administration and Congress recognized that in order to increase resilience, some of the manufacturing needed to be built here. So I would say you read the intentions correctly.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I do think also that Secretary Raimondo has said that the CHIPS Act is a national security concern for the United States that is used to continue to build our own national security, and that bringing semiconductor production back to the United States is part of the strategy for enhancing the U.S. national security, and that is kind of where they're coming from.
Yes, Jeffrey.
Very quickly, just want to point out that I agree with what both Dan and Lana said. On the resiliency and redundancy portion of the program, it's important to remember that the facilities, for example, that TSMC is investing in out in Arizona, as Lana pointed out early on, that's at best a 5 or 4 nanometer facility with upgrades. The time scale in these projects is massive, 5 to 10 years before you're up and operational with a significant capital expenditure. So, but that doesn't get you cutting edge technology. And it's also worth noting that it's redundancy and resiliency, and to some extent duplication for national security purposes. And so I think the last point I'll make is that yes, it is a venture into industrial policy for the United States in a way that hasn't been undertaken in many years. But it's also important to remember where the industries in Japan, in South Korea, and in Taiwan came from with respect to those particular issue areas that were in part supported significantly by industrial policies, for example, KNL. Thank you.
Okay, that leads me to a very quick question that I have for each of you. That you said industrial policy making in the US. As we know, semiconductors are both security and economic, right? It comes together very complicated ways together. But so my question, starting with you, Jeffrey, is a yes/no question. Will geopolitics, when you look into the future, do you think geopolitics is going to prevail over any economic logic, whatever that may be, in the semiconductor field going forward?
I
Yes
think
or no?
yes.
Okay, you.
Can I?
You're an academic.
They're closely intertwined because one, in many ways, semiconductors themselves are the product of a very complex process, but in many ways, they're actually the means towards application, right? AI, quantum computing. That's where the real game is. I think that's where people care.
But is geopolitics going to drive it, or is economics going to drive it? It depends. That's what
Geopolitics, I'll see.
Okay, to geopolitics and Locke, are you in the business?
I would say, yes, unfortunately, geopolitics is very much of a driver.
Okay, you heard it here. Okay, all right. Well, listen, this has been a fantastic set of presentations by my panelists, and I want to thank the audience and especially our students here for tremendous questions. And again, please join us for another time in May for another Taiwan conference. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, that's just thank you. You're right, I can't answer with the yes or no. You just pick it up.